Welcome to installing default and named instances. The installation process for installing SQL Server is fairly basic and fairly straightforward. Microsoft's actually done a fairly good job making the installation process pretty painless. Now, the downside to installing multiple instances of SQL Server is that each instance is installed one at a time. You can't just run the installer once and tell SQL Server to install 6 instances on a machine. Each instance is totally independent from the other instances, as far as installation, the files that are used on the hard drive, and communication within instances. You can consider an instance to be a silo unto itself. It doesn't know anything about the other instances on the machine. Now, when installing multiple instances on a server, make sure that you keep in mind that you can only use the name of the instance once. Instance names have to be unique for the server they're installed on. So, for example, if you had a server named SQL1, on that server you could have instance 1, instance 2, instance 3, but you could not have 2 instances called instance 1, even if they're different versions of SQL Server. The installation process is exactly the same for each instance of SQL Server you install, be it a default instance or a named instance. Let's go ahead and look at a demonstration of how to actually do a SQL Server installation. So you can see here, I've got the SQL Server Installation Center up. Basically, I've inserted the DVD, and the thing has popped up on the screen automatically. I've clicked on the installation option on the menu on the left, and I'm now going to click New SQL Server Standalone Installation, or Add Features to an Existing Installation. This is going to run me through the wizard to allow me to do an installation. The first thing that setup does is run a check to make sure that I can actually install SQL Server on this machine. It's making sure that I'm an administrator, that I have the appropriate privileges that I need, that the computer does not need to restart, that WMI is installed and configured correctly, that the registry keys on this machine are valid, long path names to the files of the installation media are not longer than they can be, the SQL Server setup product and compatibility has passed its check, and that we have the .NET Framework 2.0 and 3.5 installed. We click OK on that check, and we'll be prompted with the next wizard in just a minute. The next screen that comes up is going to prompt you for a product key. Either specify the edition that you want to install, or if you have a product key for Standard or Enterprise Edition, select the Enter the Product Key option, enter your product key, and then click Next. We're just going to go ahead and install the Evaluation Edition, which is effectively the Enterprise Edition of the product. The next screen is the license terms. You obviously have to accept those. If you're in a network that supports it and your company policy does not prevent it, I would recommend clicking the Send Feature Usage Data to Microsoft option. That's going to give them information about how you use the installer, what features you installed, how long it took, and any problems that came along. Select the available option if you want to use it, and then click Next. This next screen is checking for available updates. My virtual machines don't have access to the internet, so I'm going to turn that feature off. You may or may not want to turn that feature on during the installation process. If you leave that on and it downloads the available updates, SQL Server is going to be patched to the newest, most current version. If you need to patch to a specific version, either by corporate policy or by a vendor's requirement or development team's requirement, uncheck that box so that you do not install the patches. Click Next. This is going to install the setup files. Basically, we're installing the bootstrapper and various other files that we need to have installed on the system. Now, in this particular case, I've gotten a message that says one or more files have operations pending. I'm going to need to restart the computer once setup is completed, which is fine. This is not yet a production server, so that won't be a problem. We click OK, and Microsoft SQL Server Installer goes on to the next part of the installation process. At this point, we run another set of rule checks to make sure that there's some additional things that are installed correctly. In this case, we have 2 warnings. The first one is that there's a problem with the .NET application security. Click on the warning, and it simply tells us that it does not have internet access, so it cannot get an updated list of certificate root authorities. That's fine, we're well aware of that problem. If you do get that, it's because your firewall is preventing outbound access or because your machines don't have internet access. If that's the case, you're going to want to follow the instructions on that dialog box, download and install the file as prompted. Click on the Windows Firewall warning. Windows Firewall is enabled. Make sure the appropriate ports are enabled for remote access. You'll always want to do that. In this case, it's not going to be an issue as we're not going to have remote clients connecting. The next page asks us what setup role we want to use. If we're going to do a SQL Server feature installation, a Power Pivot for SharePoint installation, or all features with defaults. 99% of the time, you're probably going to be using the top option, SQL Server feature installation, which is what we're going to be using now. So here we're prompted with the list of the services that we can install. So we're going to go ahead and select Database Engine Services and the Management Tools. Always select Management Tools Complete on a machine you're going to be using to administrate SQL Server. If you're installing the tools on an end user's machine where they're not going to be doing administrative functions, you can select Management Tools Basic. This will remove some extra features such as managing SQL Server Agent from their machine, because these are features they're never going to use anyway. We then click Next. Now, depending on what features you set on the feature selection, this will change the pages in the wizard that you're displayed, as well as the rules that are shown on this Installation Rules page. When the Installation Rules page shows up, make sure there's nothing on here that's showing a warning or an error message and resolve any problems that come up. Because we're doing such a minimal install, there's just a minimal number of things on the checklist. The next page is the instance configuration. Now, this is the important one to look at when dealing with default and named instances. This is where you're going to set your instance name. Now, if we're using the default instance, we simply specify default instance by selecting the radio button. Now, you can only have one default instance on a machine. That's because a default instance is simply a named instance where the name is MS SQL Server. If we need a named instance, we select the named instance radio button and then type in the instance name. When we click out of that box, you'll notice the instance ID changes. We want to leave the instance ID to match the instance name. Instance ID is used for backwards compatibility and gets very, very complex to manage a SQL Server if the instance ID and the instance name are different. You'll also notice the SQL Server directory path listed in the label below has also changed to match the instance ID. We're going to go ahead and set this back to a default instance. You'll notice everything changes back to MS SQL Server for the instance name, the instance ID, and the SQL Server directory. We'll go ahead and continue this demonstration during the next video.